Hello, Nicholas. Can you hear me? Are you
I
there?
can.
Okay, that's good. We were having some technical difficulties with StreamYard and Facebook, and hopefully that has been resolved. But if you were on the original stream, thank you for coming back. We appreciate you very much. It's very nice of you. So how are things over in Florida? Because you're on the other side of the country.
Things are still warm. Things are currently smoky. The wildfire smoke from Canada finally made its way all the way down south, so that's kind of interesting. And in my own little personal corner of Central Florida, things are productive. There's been a lot happening behind the scenes, prepping for trips, recovering from trips, and more along those lines.
You were just up north at a big festival, right?
I was with some people you know pretty well.
Yeah. So how was Temple Fest?
It was great. I'm really thankful I had that experience. It was my first time going in person. I had participated in a couple virtual ones, which were lovely, but it's not at all the same. And I'm just so thankful for that dose of community.
Yeah.
When we do this kind of thing in virtual spaces, it's not the same kind of community, no matter how hard we work. And it is rich and rewarding and important. But then, like, you get to be surrounded by people you haven't seen in years and, like, actually hug folks that you like. And
It makes a difference.
It really does.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed that.
Well, good. Yeah, I know the boys had a good time. So I imagine it was a feeling that was mutual with all attendees and presenters. So that's good. Today we are supposed to be talking about Tourmaline. So first of all, you being somebody who is a little bit more well versed in the Queen's English, are we pronouncing it wrong when we say Tourmaline, or is it supposed to be Tourmaline? Like, what's the appropriate way to pronounce this incredible crystal ally?
I'm gonna conjecture here. I haven't really sat down to look at what the major authorities on the orthoepy, which is the study of pronunciation of the English language, have to say. But I would imagine because both tour and tour are appropriate pronunciations given your dialect for the word tour, then any variation of that has to be acceptable for the name of this mineral species when it comes to that first syllable. It does derive, I believe, from a Sinhalese word, Tourmaline, which is spelled T-U-R. So I might, if I wanted to be pedantic, and today's one of those rare days when I don't have an opinion, but if I wanted to be pedantic, I might endorse Tourmaline stronger than Tourmaline, but that's not how we spell it today. So I'm imagining that O-U-R part of it has to have had some Frenchification involved as it made its way.
The French. Yeah.
Yes.
No. Yeah. I know. Well, and that was at one point too. I mean, French was like the universal language. So, I mean, a lot of things we just can't get away from that, especially when it comes to names.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So we usually think of tourmaline, and it comes. I didn't get a super clear picture of it, but this is a tourmalated quartz. So this is a piece of quartz that has been carved, but it has these beautiful streaks of tourmaline that are going through it. Most of the time when we see tourmaline out in the wild, we're seeing the black tourmaline. We're seeing it's the most abundant, if I remember correctly, variety of tourmaline that is available is this black stuff. We also, there's other colors which we'll get into, but then the other thing that we can see a lot of is this, which is dravite, which is brown tourmaline, or root beer tourmaline, sometimes it's called. So we're used to seeing them in one of these two kind of forms, right, where it's either black or brown, and that's something that we're just familiar with. It has it's one of these stones that when I was writing the book, I had a little field day with tourmaline, because tourmaline is so diverse, in its colors and its vibration. One stone can have all of these variants, and they can be palpably discernible. So it's interesting to me. So when it comes to the tourmaline, most of us, again, we're back in full circle here. We're back to the brown and the black and the stuff like that. What is, from your experience as a crystal seller, as an author, when it comes to those two types of tourmaline, what are the properties that people tend to be the most attracted to, in your opinion?
So a lot of people gravitate to the tourmaline group at large. And we'll circle back around to the geology and chemistry of this in a moment, but people tend to come to tourmalines for things like grounding, protection, the movement of energy, and those seem to be the kind of major themes. But tourmaline is not like quartz in that when we look at a piece of citrine, a piece of smoky quartz, even an agate or a jasper or a chalcedony alongside, the pinnacle of quartzdom, of clear quartz, they're all the same mineral species. They all have the same fundamental chemistry, the same chemical formula, the same unit cell. None of that changes. It's the way we stack those unit cells to change the outer shape, or we might fold in a couple spare molecules here or there of other things that provide variations in color. But tourmaline is not like quartz because it's not a single mineral species. It's actually a group of more or less related individual species that are, I think there are about a dozen, give or take, valid species right now. I was actually reviewing a science book on tourmaline before our chat today, and it had a couple species in there that we have invalidated. So it had about 14 or 15 in the list of valid tourmaline species. But we tend to treat tourmaline like it is a monolith of different colors, the way we do with quartz or calcite or agate. But it's really quite a bit more nuanced than that. And each species of tourmaline has its own chemical formula with a little room for variation. And each species also comes in more than one color. So it does get a little complicated when we try to treat them as a group and look at that meta level at what tourmalines do. But I think you're absolutely right. Most folks probably are at least initially drawn to or initially have access to the schorl or black tourmaline, sometimes known as aphrosite and sometimes is not black to make things more complicated. And then also the dravite, which is a magnesium and or calcium rich member of the tourmaline group that frequently occurs in shades of brown, but also sometimes green or red.
Yeah, I know tourmaline has this, like the black tourmaline. It's just like black clothes. Like when they start to fade, some of them are more red, some of them are more blue, and you can kind of see like how whatever constituted the black essentially. And tourmaline, you have black tourmaline that's more of a blue color, and you've got black tourmaline that's got more of kind of a reddish color to it, and it's still black, but you can see under the right type of light that there's these variants in it. And it's really interesting. There's a lot of diversity even within one of those color units. So Margaret Ann Limbo, I can't remember which book it was, but in I think it was Crystal Healing, she talks about tourmaline being associated with the root quartz. And I actually think when she came on the show many, many years ago, and we were talking about this, because I was like, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't ever thought of tourmaline as a root chakra kind of stone. But then I started working with it that way, and it blew my mind because it really did stimulate that root chakra, all of those lower, physical energies. And was really interesting to me in a way that was similar to like how carnelian would stimulate things. And that was shocking to me because, I mean, if we just go off of like color theory and stuff alone, that is not something like going with like a black tourmaline wouldn't have been something I would have associated there. But there is something just in all of tourmaline and all of the tourmalines that is very activating. It's very, I don't want to say agitating, but it stirs things up. It gets things to move. And I think that was always really interesting. So from a crystal healing perspective, when you're working with tourmaline, do you tend to kind of put it into that physical kind of energy system, or are you looking at it more from a multi-energy body kind of way, if that makes sense? Does that make sense? What I'm asking, does that make sense?
It does. And, because they're not all the same chemically, I don't treat them all the same therapeutically. There's some themes that carry through owed to patterns in their chemical formulas and patterns in their structure. So maybe it's time we actually define what tourmaline is, since we can't just say, like we could with quartz is alpha silicon dioxide. It forms in the trigonal crystal system. It has this hardness. It has this exact formula. Things are a little bit more fluid with the tourmaline group because it's just that, a group. So tourmalines are Among the most abundant borosilicate minerals, they belong to the trigonal crystal group. So if we look at the axes among their, that demonstrate the relationships between the angles and faces, we see that there's a strong threefold symmetry. Can they have more than three sides? Absolutely, but there'll be a strong threefold symmetry to it. And they get a rap for having very complicated chemistry because there are so many different ones. But silicates themselves are not a monolith either. We have different terms that describe the kinds of structures those silica ions will make together as they kind of build the rest of that substance. So something like quartz is what we call a tectosilicate or a framework silicate. We have micas, which are sheet silicates, phyllosilicates, because the silica forms sheets all in one plane. You've got things like amphibole minerals, which are chain silicates, inosilicates. We've got garnets, which are nesosilicates. It's an island silicate, an island in the sea of metals and other stuff. But in the tourmaline group, we have cyclosilicates. They form little ring structures. Beryls are also very famously cyclosilicates. And something that I find really common to things with this kind of crystal structure in the silica group is the ability to direct energy through that kind of column or channel that exists at the molecular level. And ring silicates themselves can be grouped into two essential kinds. The rings can line up so you could like see through them if you were smaller than those molecules, or they will be kind of arranged more chaotically and overlap in different ways to be more like a sponge. And there are relatively few of those spongiform cyclosilicates that we work with in crystal healing. Notable ones include sigillite and chrysocolla. We get a lot more of those channel or column ones where the rings all kind of line up. So we could, imagine that they have some continuity to them. So one of the great gifts of tourmaline group minerals, because they have that ring silica structure, is unifying energies, collecting them around a kind of central focus, and moving them when they are stuck. So we might work with something like a black tourmaline for really deep grounding when we have something that impedes our ability to connect to the earth. We might work with something like green tourmaline when we feel that there is some kind of stagnancy in our physical vitality. Maybe we could work with pink tourmaline if there is a blockage at the emotional level. And all those other kind of tourmalines are going to come in at different places depending on their chemistry, their color, and a few other things. But I think we try to lump them all together a little too closely when they really do have strong personalities, and the personality is less by color and more by chemistry.
It makes a lot of sense, and for a lot of reasons. It's just, if only because when you start like cutting into tourmaline, right, depending on what you're dealing with, you get a very different look and feel. And let me show it. I got a couple of pictures up here I can demonstrate that with. One of the so here's a good example. So we've got this natural kind of growth on tourmaline on the left, and then we've got a very polished tourmaline over there on the right. And theoretically, that's probably not from a natural tourmaline, I would imagine, the cut, but you get this idea that there's a clarity, there's the way that it grows. Even if you were to, let me see if I can find a better example of it, but we get this idea that there's different consistencies to it. Here's a pink tourmaline, and you can see where you've got those layers and those things that you were talking about. Now, what's interesting, tourmaline and like a pink tourmaline in a hiddenite or even a morganite, those are really easy for people to conflate and to get confused when you just look at them. When we're thinking about tourmaline, because it is so diverse and there is so much going on with it, are there certain characteristics, especially in the lighter colors, that help us identify them over something like a morganite or something along those lines? Like if I just saw the chunk of this and I saw a chunk of like hiddenite or something and maybe some morganite, I wouldn't necessarily be able to call them apart without really giving them a good look.
Yeah, so there definitely are a few things that we can look at. When it comes to mineral ID, I will say this a million times because my professors did as well. Color is the least important part of mineral ID. So looking at something at face value, just at color, doesn't tell you a lot unless it is a really unusual color and you have reasonable certainty that you can eliminate other things based on that. So, in this case, this is unusually pale for what we call rubellite tourmaline, or the pink tourmalines. In fact, they are not a separate species, but belong to the species elbaite. So elbaite comes in almost every color of the rainbow, and it can be very, very pale. It can be colorless. It can also be really saturated and be almost black. So they're going to have a strong threefold symmetry. So if you look down the cross section of the crystals, if you're looking at an actual raw piece of it that is not too fragmentary, you should be able to see about 3 faces, maybe 6 faces to that kind of bow out on each of those 3 planes of symmetry. If you look at something like morganite, it's going to have really strong hexagonal symmetry. So it'll be a little bit more radial, a little bit more perfect. We could look at things like hardness. So if we're comparing our pink tourmaline to a really pale piece of kunzite's going to have a softer hardness value. It also has perfect cleavage in at least 2 directions. So we'll see those cleavage planes that'll be absent. There are all these little things that we have to start looking at that are more than just color. And we can only do that with familiarity with more than its metaphysical properties. So there's an expression that we use in geology that the best geologist is not the person who has the best degree or the best equipment. It's the one who's touched the most rocks. So if you want to be the best crystal identifier, it's not because you've taken all the certifications and read all the books. It's because you've gone out and played with rocks. And we really have to start looking at features beyond color for some of those telltale signs. And it doesn't take too long before you start to observe things that are harder to put in words, like the kind of luster on the surface of a morganite looks different to that of tourmaline. The depth of the grooves that you're going to see on most pieces of any of the tourmaline group are going to be a slightly different texture than those that we're going to find on kunzite and so on and so forth. So the homework assignment is just go play with rocks.
That's always your homework assignment.
Pretty
like
much.
Always. Yeah, like always. Okay. So when we have this family of minerals that is super diverse because it has a lot of different things going on in it. And sometimes, again, things are brought into this family that maybe don't belong there. And there's a lot of confusion sometimes, but really we have this gorgeous, gorgeous stone either way, right? So when we're talking about tourmaline itself, it's beautiful. It's I don't care what we're looking at as far as like if it's just a raw piece or if it's something that's super polished. I love tourmaline and I love working with tourmaline. I love the energy of tourmaline. When you are going through and you are working with the healing aspects of things, because that is definitely your modality, what are you like if we were just to heal with tourmaline, if all we had were tourmalines to pick from, right? What would you be going to for like the different parts of the body? So if we just broke down our etheric anatomy into the mind, the body, and the spirit, what types of tourmaline would you associate or work with for each of those things?
So those that are rich in things like iron are going to have the greatest connection to our physical body. So it's going to be our black tourmaline or schorl, sometimes known as aphrodite, which has some essential iron in its chemistry. Its formula requires iron to be present, in other words. We could also look at stuff like our magnesium-rich tourmalines like dravite, uvite, which contains a lot of calcium, could also be great for that because these are substances that have affinity with our physical structures on a vibrational level, but also on a chemical level. We're kind of made out of those things. We could also maybe consider green tourmaline in this group because it derives its color. Its chromophore is from iron, sometimes from vanadium, but that's probably not very likely to happen in most cases. So we can certainly thank iron for being present in these. if we wanted to work on the psyche, the part of us that is a little bit more ephemeral, we could consider any of the lithium-rich tourmalines. So this is the species elbaite or the species lidicotite. Both of those are multicolored. Elbaite is a lot more common, and usually we find that in pinks and greens and watermelons, but also sometimes blues and colorless and other shades. And the lithium content there gives us a sense of buoyancy and hope and really uplifts the psyche as a whole. If it's the intellect side that we want to work with on that, maybe we go with the hardness, the firmness, the directness that iron gives us with green tourmaline. Maybe we go with blue tourmaline, which is a particular affinity with the mind. And when we get to that more numinous part of us, the more, we'll say, etheric or less substantial part, there are a few ways that we could go. We can definitely look at our lithium bearing rocks again because they're so uplifting. I also find that in particular, what they know as Paraiba tourmaline or Cuprian elbaite, which has copper in it, could be a really good choice for our spirit self versus our psyche or our body.
I love it, and I'm on board with all of that. I will say, before we get to a question that came through, so there is. Let me see if I can pull it up here. This baby. So we've got this. This is a color combo. And I know that you're like, don't worry about color so much, but this is a color combo that I love and am obsessed with. And this isn't a piece of my own. This is one that I wish I could find. I could find a beautiful example of it. But you got the black, we have the green, and then we've got blue. And when we have color combos, so like this, or with something like watermelon tourmaline, which it has beautiful, it's like pink and green. And so we've got these different color combos. How does that affect the energy?
So, first and foremost, when we look at something like we've got on the screen now, this is very clearly a piece of elbaite tourmaline, one of the most common gem varieties that you find. And what is responsible for the graduation in color, the distinct zones, is just very, very small. We're talking like parts per million changes in chemistry, where one ion is being substituted for another, or a pair of ions is being substituted for another pair, because tourmaline likes to do stuff in pairs and groups. So we've got probably some iron, maybe iron titanium bonded in the deepest, darkest part of that looks black. Up against a brighter light, they will probably be green. We've got our middle section, which is a richer green that could maybe have some chromium in there. And then, what is visually the bottom here with the blue, that's probably iron connected to titanium. They're sharing some electrons there as they substitute in the crystal structure. So we see with tourmaline's ability to shift colors by shifting tiny bits of its chemistry, that it energetically is related to patterns of flux and change and adaptation. And for this reason, for at least a couple of centuries now, it has been associated with the planet Mercury and the sign of Gemini, because those are associated with movement and communication and other things that require us to be in a state of change.
Yeah. One of the things I love to work with tourmaline for the most is change, is adapting and evolving in those situations. So we've got an interesting question. This is by Marina, and she says, greetings. Is it possible for amethyst to have tourmaline in it? I have a small amethyst that has dark specks in it. So yes, it is possible. But the chances of it being tourmaline in specky form like that's probably not tourmaline. Is that correct?
It is.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
It's not very likely that it could be tourmaline. Tourmaline and amethyst tend to form in different kinds of geological environments. Both can occur in igneous rocks. Tourmaline really likes pegmatites. Amethyst does not. So they're not very likely to form together. Amethyst can have lots of cool inclusions in there. Very small or very dark, small specks rather, are probably going to be iron oxide or iron hydroxide minerals, goethite being the most common. And depending on its state of oxidation, it can range from golden to black and still be the same mineral inclusion inside there. When golden, it's sometimes misidentified as the mineral cacoxenite, which to date has never, ever, 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 ever been analytically confirmed in a piece of quartz of any color ever. So there's no cacoxenite and amethyst, it's all goethite, or things more closely related to goethite. But every now and then we get some really cool stuff. There are some really fine examples of clusters of amethystine quartz that tend to be on the paler side, but are sometimes more richly colored, that will have specular hematite and green epidote needles inside them. And those come from China. I can't remember the exact location, but that's kind of a fun inclusion that could resemble tourmaline if
maybe that's what I'm thinking, because I remember being in Tucson and seeing a giant piece of ametrine, and it had what I thought was black tourmaline that shot up through the center, and then off the top of it had some calcite Drew's beautifulness going on, and it was one of the weirdest beautiful, like it looked alien, it's just one of those things, and I'm like, that's got to be tourmaline, but that's what I remember. But I'm gonna go with you on that. I because your rocky stuff better than I do. So yeah. How often is it that we find like pieces of carbon and things like that inside of chunks of amethyst? Or, I mean, I know we need to get back to tourmaline, but inside of something like that, like how often are carbon, like just chunks of carbon? I know we see that in things like Herkimer diamonds and things like that, but in an amethyst, how often would that be?
So, what the market will often label carbon is often far more complicated than just being carbon. It can be hydrocarbon minerals. So they're going to have hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen in varying amounts. They could have essential water in their structure. So they could be things like anthraxolite and other stuff. I have seen some, we'll say, carbonaceous or carboniferous, in other words, carbon-bearing inclusions inside amethysts in places like Koboboseb and Brandberg Mountains in Namibia. Occasionally they'll have stuff like that. And I want to say I've seen maybe some carbon-rich inclusions in small amethysts from Mexico. I know I've seen them in clear quartz in nearby places, but I'd have to rack my brain on that. But carbon as an organic substance, like we tend to consider hydrocarbons to be, is not super common as inclusions in gem quality crystals. Carbon as like a mineral forming element is all over the place because we have like carbonate minerals and other things. So when it comes to amethyst and calcite often form together in those hydrothermal environments that produce the beautiful cathedrals and vugs and other things. But that is calcium carbonate. So calcium, carbon, and oxygen creating one substance that is superimposed on top of that amethyst, or sometimes the other way around.
Okay, that makes sense. I think I was following you. Were you guys following? That was a lot. That's good. Okay, so back to our amazing tourmaline here. So we got this huge family. We have all this diversity inside of it. We've talked about why we might want to work with one type of tourmaline over another for the different things that are going on with the body. But then we have this idea that tourmaline and magic is very right? Whenever we work in a magical situation, we're looking at the projective qualities of something and working with those things versus the supplemental energy that we get when we carry those stones or anything like that. So when we talk about the projective qualities of stones, tourmaline has always been one of those mineral families that I can point to and go, you're probably going to feel something. And somebody mentioned earlier on in the chat that it was Rachel. She said that she didn't feel black tourmaline was grounding at all. And I think that is fascinating because I don't actually find it to be something that's grounding. I know a lot of people go to it for those reasons. And in magic, we'll use tourmaline to like stop things in their tracks and stuff like that. But for me, it's always been a little more pointy, I think is a good way to kind of put it. So when we are talking about jumping in and working with the projective qualities of a stone in magic, what is tourmaline like for you? Why is it a go-to, and what is it a go-to for?
So when I think about the unifying things about tourmalines, One of the things we haven't talked about yet is the fact they're borosilicates. They're silicates of boron and usually other things, which is complicated. And boron is kind of fun because it's a nonmetal, but it has some of the physical and chemical attributes of metals. So by itself, boron is right on this cusp, this liminal threshold between different states. And vibrationally, it's really good for harmonizing things, for balancing, opposing forces. And one of the energetic qualities that I find boron-rich minerals to have is they endow us with a sense of control over our lives. And originally, when we planned our Tourmaline talk, was in the midst of Mercury retrograde, and we kind of lost control. So we never had that talk happen then. And I think that's kind of funny and poetic and perfectly timed as things would happen. But I would turn to Tourmaline when I feel like my sense of agency is somehow inhibited. On the one hand, that projective quality of getting things that are stuck moving again, owed to its cyclosilicate structure, but then we add into that the emotional feeling, the psychological state of feeling control again when things are otherwise slipping away from us. It can be a really powerful tool to just know that whatever power I'm going to draw up from within is going to make change. And so it's going to boost magic in the big picture, whatever that magic is going to be, whether you're picking a black tourmaline for one project or pink tourmaline for another. It's still going to enhance the work that you're doing by enhancing how your willpower ripples out into the world around you.
Absolutely. I love that. You're so eloquent when you talk about this stuff. I feel absolutely the same. I'm also going to just add that it's a stone that I think so we talk about, like in my book, the Crystal Magic for the Modern Witch, I talk about the dragon energy in stones. Tourmaline is one of those super potent, very easy to go find dragon energies. Whereas like, I feel like, a stone like golden healer quartz, for example, finding that dragon was like I still don't even know if it was that, or if it was just like, I don't know. Anyway, but there's a more aggressive spiritual form that's in these crystals. And with tourmaline, all of them that I've touched and been able to kind of coax, that energy is very, very excited and excitable and ready to come out and be there, which is why I think people work with it for protection so much, and they get that sense that, okay, the stone has something that maybe I don't have on my own, and that's a really, really freaking cool thing. Okay, are there any other thoughts about tourmaline that you want to add to what we've been talking about today?
I would say probably the last thing I want to leave people with is to treat them like they are weirdly related and not related at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's often the ones we don't think are as closely related as really are. So when you get your piece of indicolite, when you get your piece of rubellite, your watermelon tourmaline, they're all the same species. If you're lucky enough to find a piece of acrowite or colorless tourmaline, it's also probably the same species. But then we start looking at stuff like black and brown, which could be almost indistinguishable depending on where they come from in the world, and they have very distinct chemistries, very, very distinct chemistries. And those are all fun things to consider. But how about one really cool geological fact about an unusual occurrence of tourmaline?
Please.
Yeah. So in the 1980s, there was a discovery of tourmaline in the northeastern part of Brazil in the state of Paraíba, which came out in colors of like neon blues and greens and purples. And I have one piece here that is much less vibrant than most of its colleagues, we'll say. And it was like just took the world by storm and was pretty much exhausted in a few years. In recent years, they've gone back and into the same kind of mining areas and found a few more deposits of it in pegmatites, but not to the same quality or quantity that was before. And for ever, people wanted more of this elbite. And what's fun is that it gets its color from copper substituting for part of its crystal structure, and that seemed to enhance the vibrancy of colors compared to other stuff. But if you look at where it is on the northeastern part of Brazil, and you cross the ocean and go over to Western Africa, you find deposits of Cuprian elbaite that differ in chemistry only very slightly and have almost identical colors in places like Mozambique, which
Hmm.
is really good evidence that maybe this tourmaline formed before the continents separated, or at least that the geological factors that would eventually yield both were present before the continents separated. So here we are with
That's
this
cool.
really amazing, really rare, hard to find variety of tourmaline called Cuprian elbaite, which just means copper bearing elbaite, that we find in places that used to touch each other.
That's really cool. That's hella cool. I love when we find this stuff. I love all of it. I even when it's like they found weird lemur bones in Madagascar and you know things like that, and it's just like I love that we can trace the growth of our planet and how it's moving and shaking and because of things like geology and what's going on with the minerals and there. I think that's fascinating. That's really cool. Okay. I'm going to put that in my hat and think on that. It is now time for crystal remedies. Just so you know, Nicholas and I, we are not doctors. Don't think we are or substitute something that we're saying for medical advice because that would be dumb. And on that note, so here we are. We actually only have a couple today, which is totally okay. And this is gonna be. We'll start with the easy one. So it is now spooky season, Nicholas. What crystals would you work with if you wanted to communicate with a ghost?
Oh, so many actually. But let's keep it real simple.
Mhm.
Let's say fossils because they used to be living things and now they're not. So amber,
Mhm.
jet, fossil coral, fossil bone,
Mhm.
you name it. That's a great one. And then another one that I find really particularly helpful for communicating across that veil would be obsidian.
Obsidian, absolutely, yeah. All of the above, 100,000%. I'm also finding that, in particular, the last couple of years, that staroite has been really good for helping ghosts come through stronger, and not just for like me, but like for other people in the group and things like that. So that's been pretty handy. So there's that little bit to it. Okay. So, what stone would you recommend giving to your children as they go trick or treating? It
Hmm.
doesn't say for what though. It doesn't say for protection or for like more candy, or it just says what would you give them?
Oh, okay. So we got options then.
Yeah.
Um, how about something like carnelian because it has historical ties to protection and it's a stone of joy, of enthusiasm, of optimism, and like that stereotype of the really cute kid that knocks on your door and is just like extra precious you want to sneak the full-sized candy bar to. So like we're
Mhm.
going to keep them safe and we're going to get them the good stuff with
Mm.
carnelian.
I like that. I like that a lot. I would just give them pyrite and be like, here's so that you get all the good stuff and that you have a wonderful, abundant evening. It's also heavy, so that if you have to put it in your hand, you can. I'm okay. No, but it could be protective depending on what you're how you're doing about it. All right, all right. Okay, so you and your partner are going to be spending a Halloween evening alone. What stone would you be inviting into that situation?
Mahogany obsidian.
Ooh, why?
So it's a sexy kind of rock.
Mhm.
There aren't too many rocks that decorate our boudoir for the sake of being there, other than like what I empty from my
Yeah,
pockets every day.
yeah.
But we have a really large sphere of mahogany obsidian there because it's good for chemistry, we'll say.
Mm. It is good for I could absolutely see that. Okay, 100%. I would actually go tourmaline. So I would say pick a tourmaline, any tourmaline. I think that you would get everything from a much easier time watching a spooky movie to a much easier time getting down and spooky. So it just kind of, I think tourmaline actually would be my crystal du jour for that. All right. So the next one is you are going to a party, a Halloween party, and you're worried about safety, you're worried about having a good time. Same kind of idea with like the trick or treating, but now we're a little more adult. It isn't about kids necessarily. It's about us doing us things. What would you say?
It's hard for me to imagine a reality where I go to a party, but once upon a time, when that was a real thing, I would probably stick with things that were gonna help me have a good time, but also keep my wits about me. I'm really tempted to recommend magnetite rather, or lodestone for this. Because we get like the iron for protection and defense, but it also helps us navigate situations, navigate things, and is traditionally used to attract the good stuff. So like we're gonna be the life of the party, we're gonna make the best connections, we're gonna have the most amount of fun, and still stay safe and know where to go and what to do.
Okay. And our last question for the day is, if you were in a scary movie, what crystal would you recommend to the final girl? And so I think it kind of depends on what scary movie, because if we're talking like slashers, that would be one thing versus like an alien movie. So let's say Scream. That's an easy one. So let's say you're in Scream. What crystal would you recommend to the people who are in that situation?
Let's go with Garnet, because those kinds of like final situations require so much stamina to get through.
Mm.
You're like screaming at them, run, run. So let's give them something that's going to give them that ability to keep going.
I like that. I would say a big dragon tooth amethyst that they could just hit people with, like a club, or just like throw like an axe. That's what I would do. But all right, all of the above. I think that all works. I think that's all very handy. And yeah, all right, Nicholas. Well, thank you, and thank you everybody at home for tuning in. We really super appreciate it. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. We've got so many stones. I don't think we're ever going to run out of stones to talk about, Nicholas. Like, just to be honest with you, I don't see that ever happening. So you might be stuck with me forever. We do have some updates coming up. So in our next episode, we'll let you know about the dates for the next upcoming Crystal Magic Intensive, which is going to be super freaking cool. And we also have gigs and other things happening. So we'll let you know about all that stuff next time. But in the meantime, grab a stone, give it a hug, and, I don't know, do some magic, because that's what we're here to do. Change the world. Barnwish.com, and you can find Nicholas at
TheLuminousPearl.com.
TheLuminousPearl.com. We'll see you in a couple weeks, everybody.